I want to talk to you about the best podcast equipment and setup this year. And here are the overall considerations I want you to really think about. When you think about podcast equipment and setup, you need to really understand that the equipment actually is going to be very powerful, especially if you have an established community already, an established listener audience. Okay, because when you start, it doesn't really matter what kind of equipment you have, but the more established you are, the if you have a big audience, if you have a big listenership, then the equipment is going to play an important role right off the bat. So I want to share with you the types of podcast equipment and what you as a podcaster you might need them. Okay, and so first you need the microphone. So podcast equipment and setup. So you might imagine the typical musician's mic when you think about a microphone. And while you can absolutely use one of those to podcast, it's actually worth noting that mics come in many forms, shapes, and sizes. Okay, so the bottom line is that a microphone is simply the tech needed to hear your voice and send it to be recorded somewhere. So this makes it the first part of our recording chain this year. Okay, so that's number one. So you have a microphone. Then you also have to think about what. Now the thing is, when you think about microphone, you have all kinds of microphones. But again, it depends on the sort of resources you have, your budget. So that's an important element to think about. So you can have a USB microphone, for instance, or an XLR microphone. So when I think about USB microphone, this is actually a common and simple piece of podcast equipment. Okay, and so you can have a condenser mics as opposed to dynamic mics. Okay, and those actually plug straight into your computer via, oddly enough, a USB cable. And USB mics are ideal for beginners, especially folks who do solo or monologue style shows and those running online interview podcasts. Almost all of these mics have a cardioid polar pattern, which means that they are actually designed to pick up the voice of one single speaker at a time. So that's for USB microphones. And then you have also the XLR microphones. So those actually need additional equipment to run them. They don't plug straight into your computer, but instead go into an interface, preamp, mixer, or digital recorder. You can actually get interfaces, mixers, and digital recorders in USB form though. So you can actually run an XLR mic into your computer, just not so directly, okay? It's more convoluted. And XLR mics are suited to folks who want premium audio quality and a lot more production flexibility, as well as those who don't want to be tied to a computer at all times. So it's a great idea to look for microphones with a shock mount and a built-in pop filter. So that's really important to think about that too. So when we talk about microphones, which one should you go for, condenser or dynamic microphones? What's the best quality? Now, while XLR and USB tell us how the mic is connected and what it's connected to, the terms condenser and dynamic tell us actually how the mic is built and how it functions. So it gives you more granularity as to the DNA of the mic. Think of it that way. It gives you more information about the DNA of the mic. And XLR and USB mics can be either dynamic or condenser, though it's common for USB mics to fall into the latter category, which is actually condenser. And so when I speak about dynamic, what does that mean? Well, the dynamic just means more robust, more forgiving of a suboptimal environment. And condenser, you have more nuanced for vocal recordings, okay? There is actually a no best answer here when you think about the condenser or dynamic microphones. Only what works best for you and for your podcast initiative, if you will. What about wireless versus the lavalier mics? Well, not every podcaster records at a computer or is standing at a mic stand in a studio. There are situations where some creators need a little more flexibility. And take someone who does a yoga series, for example. He or she is going to be in all sorts of dynamic poses during a recording session. Then there are actually podcasters who record on the go, wherever they can. Those creators need podcast equipment that's quick, flexible, and portable. That's where lavalier and wireless mics actually come in, okay? And lavalier, or lav, if you will, lav mics, are typically seen on TV. Think of the way cable pinned to the chest of a newsreader. And a popular example of a lav mic in podcasting is actually the Rode SmartLav Plus. So that's kind of cool. Okay. You can also have the Rode Wireless Pro. So this is actually if you will, the gold standard of wireless mics in podcasting. It even has a feature known as a 32-bit floating, which makes it almost impossible to distort your audio, even if you are way too loud and your gain is set too high. So that's really good. Next, you can have recording devices that include mics, okay? And you probably already carry a mic around with you in the form of your smartphone. You can turn this into a podcast setup by adding the Rode SmartLav Plus and a SC6. This kit is ideal for on-the-go recording and location interviews. It really depends on the kind of podcast you have in the first place. And phones and laptops have built-in mics that some would consider good enough for podcasting. And as is commonly the case with audio, the good enough part is entirely down to your own opinion, but also your target audience's opinion, okay? And alternatively, there are a lot of high quality digital recorders on the market. You can record directly into this or plug additional mics into them. Again, these are actually, this constitute a great option for someone looking for a flexible and portable setup, but also depends on the quality that you want in the first place, okay? But the bottom line here is what? You are adding value. If you are having a conversation with your audience, if you're having a conversation with your listeners, then you have to really understand also, you have to put yourself in their shoes. You got to ask yourself, what can I do to improve my listeners' experience? Okay, my LX, my listener experience. And if you think that way, if you put your shoes in your listeners' shoes, if you put yourself in your listeners' shoes, then you are going to find ways to actually improve things right off the bat. And you can do these things naturally. One thing I also want to say is that when you think about the microphone, don't actually try to have sophisticated microphones at the very beginning. No, when you are a neophyte, when you are a rookie, when you're just starting your podcasting career or your podcasting journey, you want to really make sure that you start a little and you want to use what you have available to you. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Okay, once the audience comes, once the conversation gets more convoluted or deeper, if you will, you are going to have the resources. You are going to find the resources to actually beef up your equipment, and at that point you can actually go a little higher and actually have a better or more complex equipment. So besides the microphone, podcast equipment and setup, you also have the recorder, right? The recorder, podcast equipment setup. So, and speaking of digital recorders, you actually you will need a podcast equipment option for actually capturing and storing your audio, right? And this could be anything from a phone to a computer to a dedicated digital recorder itself. So let me talk about digital recorders. So a dedicated digital recorder is actually an excellent option for someone who wants a podcast on the go, but is looking for a level of sound quality above what you will get with a smartphone. On top of that, digital recorders offer a lot more settings and options for creating audio because that's what they've literally been built for. You don't necessarily need an additional mic to record into one because most of them come with built-in mics. Additional benefits include built-in SD card slot and multiple inputs. So that's kind of cool in terms of giving you flexibility, okay? And on top of that, the SD cards that I just spoke about can actually be handy when you want to quickly drop some audio files over to your desktop and can be bothered to relocate and plug in all your equipment. So from a flexibility point of view, you're gonna love the positivity that a digital recorder brings to your podcasting system. So that's for digital recorders. What about computers? Well, there are many options available to you when it comes to recording directly into a computer. You can use a DAW, a digital audio workstation like Audacity or Adobe Audition for starters. Or if you are looking to record online, or even remote interviews, there are plenty call recording options on the market nowadays too. So that's kind of cool. You might want to look at like maybe some of the best computers on the market and the best laptops for podcasting if you are actually in the market for something optimal. What about smartphones? There are a ton of recording apps out there that'll enable you to record directly into your phone. And so that's kind of cool. I mean, you probably have a default recording app on there already, but there are a few options if you want to upgrade your sound and range of flexibility. Going back to what I said, it's all about what? It's all about the amount of quality, the type of quality you want to reach, right? It also depends on the relationship you have with your audience and also the size and some kind of the complexity you want to have. Recording to a phone can be really convenient, though it lacks the flexibility and options of a dedicated digital recorder. Nevertheless, it's often a great starting point for many, and you can always upgrade your equipment further down the line. You want to start small and then you want to take it from there. So, when we talk about podcast equipment and setup, I want you to really also, like, besides the microphone, besides the recorder, I want you to really think about mixers and audio interface preamps. This is really cool to think about it that way. You don't actually need an interface or a mixer to podcast, but many podcasters do still utilize them. So you might actually think about maybe you might need one if you want to use an XLR mic, if you want to use multiple mics, if you want to record or as live with all your music, SFX played in real time, and if you want to incorporate multiple audio sources into your recording. Okay, so that's important to think about. So you can actually think about devices such as Focusrite Scarlett 2i2, but there are actually other good USB audio interfaces options for podcasters on the market too. So that's for the recording part of things, the interface, if you will. On the mixer front, there is actually a growing argument that they are no longer necessary for podcasters who want all the features listed a little earlier. So podcast-specific devices like Zoom PodTrack P4 and Rodecaster 2 are much better options these days, in our opinions. Okay, so you have to see what works for you. What about headphones? Well, headphones are a vital part of the podcast equipment lineup. You should constantly monitor your recordings, even when doing a solo show. This means using a pair of headphones while recording so you can hear exactly what's being captured. Okay, the benefit of doing so is that if there are issues, you can fix them right away. You'll also need headphones to hear your guest if you run an online interview show. They come in handy for listening back to recordings and for editing audio too, so that's kind of important. Also, you can think about acoustic treatments. So you can have the best podcast equipment and setup in the world, but if you stick it all in a poor quality room, your show will sound terrible, and I mean terrible. Okay, and so acoustic treatment for reverb is in your room is actually key. So that's an important. Also, you can think also about the pop filters to boom arms. You have other podcasting gear that you might have. Podcasting equipment rarely works in isolation, and you can add a few other pieces to your setup to really enhance your sound. So even if your mic has a built-in pop filter or windshield, it's a good idea to experiment actually with an external one. This means what? It means you can get up close with the mic, giving your voice a more intimate sound without popping plosives everywhere. Okay, a pop filter will attach to your mic stand or boom arm, and these are also good bits of kit to make part of your podcast setup because they help eliminate Henley noise, and that's important to think about that. Now, when you think about the best podcast equipment, you got to also think about editing, audio production, and publishing. Okay, because once your podcast has been recorded, you'll likely want to edit it, and so how much editing, if any, you do is entirely up to you. It depends on the kind of expectations that your audience has. Okay, and so when you actually think about editing, audio production, and publishing, you have a lot of players here. Okay, you have software and tools on the market that you can actually use on your machine to actually get things done a lot faster. So you have, for instance, Audacity and Adobe Audition. So on the editing front, you can choose one of the many software options out there. You can have Audacity and Adobe Audition. Those are actually DAWs, digital audio workstations. Okay, and both allow you to edit and produce a multi-track. These tracks can be used to move around and position various audio files to build your final episode. You can also save these sessions as project or templates too. So you have your music, transitions, and effects in place for each new episode. So that's really good in terms of efficiency. Then you also have Alitu. So if you want to do some editing as well as adding some intro and outro music, but you don't want to learn how to use the DAW, then check out Alitu. And Alitu is actually our own, one of our own best podcast maker when it comes to helping you get things done a lot faster. And what we love about this is that basically you have a call recorder built in, and so the software will do the leveling, noise reduction, compression, and EQ for you automatically. You have a lot of players on a lot of tools on the market that can do the same thing too, by the way. So that's important. And you can also, besides editing, you also need to think about podcast hosting. Okay, that's an important element. So in order to publish your podcast for the world to hear, you need to sign up for a media hosting provider. This is basically where your podcast lives online, and the hub where places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify will look to pull all your content from. Okay, so you have to think also about the best podcast host. We actually have an entire show that covers that, so that's really cool to think about right off the bat. So when you think about podcast equipment, you have to really understand that the equipment you need actually depends on the kind of setup you want to have. So when it comes to the best podcast equipment setup for podcast interviews, the podcast interviews are done either locally in person or remotely. So if you are going remote, you can actually, your setup can be as simple as a USB mic. You are essentially recording like a solo podcaster and relying on remote recording software to take care of the tech. Alternatively, you can use equipment instead of softwares for remote recordings. So audio mixers are traditional options, while there are podcast specific interfaces these days, okay, such as what I told you a little earlier. You have the Zoom PodTrack P4 or the Rodecaster 2. And so that's kind of cool. And the PodTrack P4 and Rodecaster work well for in-person recordings too. They have multiple XLR outputs so that guests can actually get their own mic. And they can also wear headphones with their own individual volume control. So that's kind of cool. And when it comes to music, podcast music, do you need any gear for podcast music? No, unless you are a musician planning to make your own. So otherwise, podcast music is typically added in the post-production and editing phase. That said, you can actually use certain types of equipment to play music and effects as live during your recordings. And this works particularly well for live broadcast and saves you from having to edit them in later. Okay. You can also go on Amazon, for instance, to actually check out some podcast equipment choices. You have a lot of options there, and you also might think about having equipment for video podcasts. So it all depends again on the sophistication you want to have. You want to give your podcast, okay? But overall, when you think about podcast equipment, think of it as a means to an end, right? Because the whole thing is not about the equipment; it's about you actually trying to really offer the best of the best to your audience. So if you are able to actually have that conversation with your audience, if you're able to actually create that sort of rapport with your audience, then you will be thinking in terms of value adding and not just putting together a bunch of equipment. No, you are trying to add value, and that's really what should be driving you in the first place. So in conclusion, in today's conversation, I spoke to you about the best podcast equipment. I gave you the overall considerations in terms of setup for beginners and professionals alike. We spoke about the microphone, the recorder, mixers and audio interface preamps, headphones, acoustic treatments. Okay. We spoke about editing, audio production, and publishing. We also spoke about overall about the podcast equipment FAQ. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.